Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're logging on from. My name is Susan Echo with ASAP, and we're glad that you could join us for the second day of the Climate Migration Workshop. So if you were here yesterday, you would have seen presentations from climate and demography experts about methodologies for predicting climate migration. You would have heard about perspectives and needs of stakeholders and rights holders in potential climate receiving communities in the Great Lakes region. And beyond that, through this workshop, we're hoping that you can participate in thought-provoking discussions that center environmental justice and affected communities in climate immigration planning. We also hope that there will be space to engage in conversations with experts, peers, and potential collaborators that help you consider how to integrate climate migration into decision making. And so, hello again, everyone. I can see that a few more people are trickling in. Welcome to the second day of the workshop hosted by ASAP. The topic for today's workshop is supporting effective immigration planning. And over the course of our time today, you will hear about climate immigration methodologies developed through the workshop. You would be participating in breakout room sessions. And the way that we've framed today's workshop is that we'll be speaking with different experts on panels. You'll be hearing them speak on 3 topical areas. So we have the housing panel speaking about housing issues. We'll also have a labor panel speaking about labor perspectives as we think and plan for climate immigration. We'll also have an infrastructure panel as well with various experts, and these sessions will be moderated. Also, during today's session, as we begin, we want to encourage you to include an IN representing infrastructure before your name, or H or L. This is because we'll be having breakout sessions later today where people will choose what rooms they want to participate in. And so when you have those names in front of, when you put those letters in front of your names, by changing your Zoom name, it'll help us know what area that you want to join in the breakout session. And during that time, we have activities that you can participate in. So we'll give further reminders as the workshop continues, but I just wanted to highlight that at the beginning of the session today. So basically, welcome to the session today. My name is Susan Echo. As I mentioned before, I'm an adaptation fellow with the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. I'm really glad that you could join us today. So I'll be giving a brief overview of what you should expect today. So in the first day, like I mentioned before, we heard about ways in which we can integrate projections of future displacement level events. We also had teams present on neighborhood livability and housing access for climate migrants across New York State. We spoke about the perspectives and challenges and data needs for climate immigration in the Great Lakes region. So today we'll have housing needs, we'll have a discussion on infrastructure needs and labor perspectives. We have excellent panelists who will be sharing with us about their perspectives on these issues. So I can see in the chat that there are questions about how to change your name. If you right click on the page, the Zoom link page, you will see something pop up that shows how you can edit it. And if you're interested in participating in the breakout room on housing, you just need to put a H before your name. If you're interested in infrastructure, please put an IN. And if you're interested in labor, please put an L. Next slide, please. So today's agenda, like I mentioned, we'll have a break in between the housing needs panel and infrastructure panel. before we get to the labor panel. And after that, by 2:05, we'll have a small group session. We'll also have a final plenary discussion, and we'll close for the day. Here again is instructions on how you can change your name, which we mentioned before. If you have any issues or if you have any problems, we have, the chat function. Please post any issues that you have, and we'll try to assist you with those. So like I mentioned before, if you have issues, please send Rachel Jacobson a Zoom private message. She'll be there to help you with any issues that you might have. We also have Brianna. You can send her an email if you have any problems through the session as we proceed. And here at ASAP, we want to go over some norms and expectations for our time together in this virtual space. The first is we encourage you to be present. In particular, we hope that you try to keep your video on if you can, but we understand that you may need to turn it off if you need a screen break, and that's okay. Every day of the course will include both presentations and small group activities. So we had those yesterday and we'll have those today as well. So it's important to be ready to engage in these activities as they come up in the agenda. The second thing we encourage you to do is to take care of yourself. We've included a break in the middle of the session today, and we hope that you can take care of your body and your brain by taking a break if you need to. Don't hesitate to take extra breaks whenever you need them. If you're in a small group setting, you may want to let folks know by speaking up or sending a note in the chat box. Take care to respect others. At ASAP, we work to embody the values of trust and transparency. We will be upholding chat rules, house rules, and what is said in this room should please stay in this room. Please mute yourself when you're not speaking. We'll be in the Zoom meeting format for the entire meeting in order to maximize our tools for interacting directly with one another. That means you'll be able to mute and unmute yourself. So please remember to mute while you're not speaking. We simply can't say this enough, and we thank you for that in advance. Next slide, please. So welcome again. This is the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. In case you weren't here with us yesterday, we want to share with you about what ASAP is all about. So ASAP is an organization that connects and supports climate change adaptation and climate resilience professionals to advance innovation, excellence in the field. We believe that climate change is a real and serious danger to all sectors and systems, that adaptation and resilience build stronger, more prepared communities, ecosystems, economies, and that equity and environmental justice must be centered in all the work that adaptation professionals do. ASAP members are building essential climate resilience for communities, ecosystems, economies across North America. The ASAP network keeps them connected, sharing, and learning and adapting. Next slide, please. So very soon we'll be transitioning into our first presentation for the day. And we hope that you can post questions through Slido. So please either scan the barcode on there or go to slido.com and enter in that number. And while you're there, you can, post questions that you have for the panelists and upvote the questions that you feel should be asked. So you have that opportunity on there to do that. There will be a link posted in the chat that you can click on to submit your questions. Please also include the name of the speaker that your question is for. You'll be able to click on the thumbs up icon to upvote questions you think that we should answer first. And if you have any questions about this, please leave them in the chat or send them to Rachel Jacobson to help through. And so it's really a great thing to welcome our first panel who will be speaking on housing needs. So during the panel today, we'll be having Osamu Kumasaka, who will be leading the panel on housing needs to support climate immigration. Osamu is a planner and researcher believes that though climate science has advanced greatly, governments struggle to engage vulnerable residents and provide resources that improve their lives. His passion is for helping underrepresented people tell their stories of environmental and housing injustice. As a consultant to cities, state agencies, and conservation nonprofits in the northeastern US, including the Nature Conservancy, the Bar Foundation, NYSERDA, and the Massachusetts State Senate. Osamu has empowered thousands of people in participatory processes that envision the future of sustainable transportation, renewable energy, water quality, river restoration, and climate resilience. He holds a BA in environmental studies from Lewis and Clark College and is currently a master's in city planning candidate at MIT DUSB. So it's my pleasure to welcome Osamu, who will be leading this session, and also welcome to all our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Yesterday, we discussed how climate migration will and already is placing further strains on our nation's woefully inadequate stock of affordable housing, leading to housing insecurity, houselessness, and displacement. Housing insecurity doesn't stop once migrants move to new locations. We are currently in the midst of an affordable housing crisis, which will be further exacerbated as climate change impacts become more severe and frequent across this country. This panel is about housing needs to support climate immigration in our two focus regions of New York and the Great Lakes, as well as across North America. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our incredible panelists today. Ron Harris is the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Minneapolis, where he leads the development and implementation of the city's resilience strategy with a key emphasis on racial equity, economic inclusion, and climate change adaptation. Lori Schumann, National Director of Resilience and Disaster Recovery for Enterprise Community Partners, is our second panelist. She currently chairs the New York State Adaptation Task Force for Buildings and advises a range of agencies and organizations on housing resilience, adaptation, and mitigation, including FEMA, the International Code Council, ICC, Fannie Mae, the Department of Energy, and the US Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. And our final panelist is Lauren E. Wang, who is a senior policy advisor at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency, where she advises climate policy and programs on housing mobility, land use, and equitable adaptation planning. So we're going to start by going around and having our panelists talk a little bit more about their work, and then we'll go into some facilitated questions and discussion between the panelists. I'd like to go ahead and start with Lori.
Thank you so much, Osama. It's just a great honor to be here with Ron, co-collaborator on a bunch of things, and Lauren, who I've been working with for years, going back to Superstorm Sandy. So I work for Enterprise Community Partners, which is a national affordable housing. We call ourselves an intermediary between government and communities. We work to build, preserve, finance, operate affordable housing across the nation. We have 11 market offices and hubs, as I call them, working to solve community-based problems across the country, like homelessness, displacement, housing preservation need. And in my role, leading our work in climate risk reduction, I work across the organization, both with our capital and our nonprofit side, to try to figure out how we're going to support the communities we serve to reduce risk from climate. And the communities we serve are located in floodplains, fire zones, on fault lines, in areas that are getting wetter while others are getting drier. we come to this space with the proposition that we have an extreme affordable housing crisis at hand in this nation. More than 45% of households are paying more than 35% of their disposable income for rent or mortgage costs. It is unsustainable. And when we talk about how climate risk shows up with the communities we serve, it undermines this existing challenge that plagues this nation. And we do not have enough affordable housing being built or retrofitted or sustained to keep up with the demand. And when a housing unit is destroyed from a hurricane or a fire, it is not easily replaced. We've been working in affordable housing for years. It is very difficult to get affordable housing built in communities because of NIMBYism and racism and classism and all the other intractable isms that our country faces. So when we talk about climate migration, and I'm excited to speak with my colleagues today, there is nowhere to migrate to. There is no affordable housing site that exists that can easily be occupied by someone who's lost their home. I'm going to give you a real short story about an experience that we recently had after Hurricane Ida, where a partner of ours that operates and owns an affordable housing 300-unit facility in Elizabeth, New Jersey, those facilities had to be vacated because of the storm. 5 residents were killed as a result of flooding in Ida, and all of these 300 households had nowhere to go because there is no affordable housing in New Jersey. So they were displaced and relocated to hotels and empty units across the state, totally dislodging and disrupting the lives of these households. Children have to find new schools. Jobs are terminated. So when we talk about migration, we need to be thinking about receiving communities and where there is going to be affordable housing for folks to turn to. It's worth mentioning these are Section 8 units. You can't, and they're place-based, right? So you can't just take these vouchers and just go anywhere in the state. So I'm just going to close there by saying, we have an extreme climate risk vulnerability at hand, and at the same time, we need more affordable housing.
Thanks so much, Lori. Next, I'd like to go to Ron.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for the invitation. My name is Ron Harris. I currently serve as the Chief Resilience Officer for the City of Minneapolis. I'm grateful to be here with my comrades in this work with Lauren and Lori here. I'll share a little bit about kind of what my role is and how I'm approaching the work of building resilience. First and foremost, resilience is, simply put, the capacity to survive, adapt, and thrive in the midst of shock, which are abrupt or acute impacts, or stress, which are more longer-term impacts. And I would love to center the vision of building resilience really in a vision of equity. Equity, to me, is a process of eliminating disparities and improving outcomes for everybody. It's an intentional and it's a continual practice of changing policies, practices, systems, and structures by prioritizing measurable change in the lives of people of color. And that measurable change is really important because we can't just talk about equity and say we need to engage communities and talk to them more and things like that if none of that stuff actually drives towards a material change in people's lived conditions. Right now, we're experiencing what a colleague of mine describes as the 5-headed horseman. We have the climate emergency, of course. We have racial injustice that was really highlighted by the murder of George Floyd that happened in my city. We've had this long running strand of economic inequality that has always been there, but the public health crisis of COVID really elevated those things. And finally, we have these collective attacks on our institutions. We saw on January 6th, the attack on democracy at the Capitol, and we're seeing attacks on media and local government to the point where it's really hard to build that kind of trust to be able to deliver on some of these things. All of those things I mentioned have a huge impact on marginalized communities to a far greater extent than the rest of the community. So when we think about the budget, for example, that's required for these continued responses to what I think are these cascading shocks and stresses, when you think about that budget that's required and the efforts that are required, it's just unsustainable, especially if cities are going to be doing this work alone. So I'm really grateful that we're bringing so many partners together this week to really talk about these issues, because it's really going to take a multi-sector collaborative approach. And I'll just close with this piece, that resilience to me doesn't really help us to necessarily predict all of our challenges, but resilience helps us to anticipate that impacted communities are going to need similar resources regardless of the specific shocks that they experience themselves. And then instead of relying on communities to mobilize independently in response to shock or emergency, we actively resource and formalize those efforts during times of non-emergency. So when we're thinking about housing, for example, we can't approach housing in migration as it relates to climate change as a siloed issue. That's going to send a ripple effect throughout our systems that we have to continue to address and make sure that these solutions aren't done in silo. And I look forward to talking more about that as we get into the questions.
Thank you so much, Ron, and thank you for your reframing resilience around the equity concerns as well, and your call for really substantive metrics and really honing in on how can we make measurable change. Lauren, I'd like to have you close us out with just a little bit more info about your work. Lauren, you're still muted, I think.
Hi there, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Osamu, Ron, Lori. It's so great to be here in your company and with this fantastic audience as well. Thank you, Susan and Rachel, for bringing us together for this important conversation. Could not agree more with the things that I have heard from you and from you, Ron, and from you, Lori. In New York City, you know, we are a local government that supports the day-to-day lives of 8.5 million, 8.8 now, according to the new census, 8.8 million New Yorkers. It's a huge population. It's a vast and complex city. We have our 5 boroughs or counties that we work across, so much diversity in there as well. And as I was talking with Rachel and Susan about, you know, what New York City could bring to this table, we recognize that our city is a microcosm of both in and out migration of things that might happen as a result of increased flooding and heat, which are our 2 greatest climate hazards here in New York City. One of our realities is that New York City is incredibly dense, incredibly interconnected. No one lives in isolation here. No one moves through the day truly alone. And we rely on systems as well in our built environment, in our social environments, and in our ecologies that are also as equally interconnected. So density and interconnectedness is something that we grapple with every day. And so it's really exciting to see as well the nuanced ways that we are beginning to weave intersectionality into the way that we talk about and do this work on adaptation. So climate change in New York City is, you know, chronic flooding, both from sea level rise driven tidal flooding, which is increasing, as well as flash flooding on inland areas, as we saw during Ida. Just this summer, we experienced actually the remnants of 3 hurricanes, Elsa, Henri, Ida, and we are still very much working to make our built environment and support our communities in their coastal flood resiliency from Hurricane Sandy almost 10 years ago. And so those are some of the foundations of our work at the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency, which is situated close to City Hall and which supports multiple city agencies, really hundreds of my colleagues in city government that are working on resiliency and adaptation. We are in this process as well, shifting from what was necessarily a reactive approach in disaster recovery to proactive adaptation approaches. And in our climate adaptation work, we are advancing policies, programs, and initiatives that are centered on the idea of climate justice, grounded in environmental justice work, and advancing the principle that all New Yorkers have the right to live, work, learn, play in safe, healthy, resilient, and sustainable environments, even as the climate changes. Some of the work that we're doing includes the New York City's 10-year comprehensive waterfront plan, which is a decadal document that sort of sets the tone and establishes a vision for the next 10 years of work on our waterfront. And because flooding is one of our major risks and heat shows up all across the city, both of these issues are front and center in our 10-year comprehensive waterfront plan. In that as well, we're identifying some North Stars for programs that are neither funded nor do they even come close to existing. And so the topic of housing is an important one, and is one we're advancing adaptation initiatives that would support housing stability, or the ability to find, secure, and maintain a home that meets your needs. Now, we recognize that in the context of climate change, and this is the migration tie-in, that where one lives today may not be safe in the future, or may not be ideal for meeting a household's needs. And so with that, we are also advancing dialogues on housing mobility, or the ability to find and secure a new home that, that improves housing stability. None of this work is going to be easy, and we also work closely with partners in a cross-sectoral way to try to wrap our heads around these issues. We in New York City as well, particularly in the seat of government, are facing our history of racist redlining practices, of racist housing and discrimination, and of other challenges that are, you know, I think, an emerging dialogue in the adaptation space, but are very much the bread and butter of affordable and public housing work. And so with that, I'm grateful to be here again in this space and to engage in dialogue with this group.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to ask people to please, if you have questions for our panelists, to submit them on in the Slido, which is linked in the chat. I'm just going to start us off with a question really for Lauren and Ron to really help us kind of situate in the cities that you work in. And I'm hoping that you could maybe talk about some of the key challenges that you've already seen or anticipate when you think about climate migration and housing in Minneapolis and in New York City. How does climate migration into, within, and out of your city represent both a challenge and an opportunity for as Lauren said, improved housing mobility and stability? And does either of you want to go first? I can, Lauren, it seems like you're still unmuted, but.
Yeah, I'll give Lauren a break, give her a little water break after a great intro. I'll start with the challenges of housing and migration due to climate change in Minneapolis. Number one, we're already experiencing climate change in Minneapolis right now, right? There's a sentiment that there's going to be these open spaces in the Great Lakes region to be able to absorb and to bring folks in. And I think that while we are well equipped to do so, we can't ignore that we're experiencing our own kind of climate impacts, even though they may look differently than our folks on the coast or in the South. So for example, number one, our public schools had to close almost a month early in the summer because of increased heat that we did not have the infrastructure to actually accommodate. And so our students were in these super, super hot school buildings, and we ended up having to close the schools. We had to regulate the water because we're experiencing drought in Minnesota. And so you couldn't be watering your lawns between certain hours of the day because of the limited access to water due to the drought. Interestingly enough, when we think about communities coming to Minnesota from outside of the US, we have to consider they may be coming from places that actually don't have a lot of trust in government. And we're experiencing challenges with trust in government right now. As you all saw with the murder of George Floyd, we're still reeling from that. We're still trying to recover from that. And that sent ripple effects that while there isn't much trust in the institution of policing, for example, that extends all the way across local government. We're not trusted really to do much. I remember back in, I want to say 2014, we had just elected our first Somali council member and our first Hmong council member. And we have high concentrations of both Somali folks and Hmong folks, some of the highest concentrations outside of their home countries. And they were coming from countries where the water wasn't safe to drink. Now, in Minneapolis, we have excellent water. And so we had to go through public campaigns, public awareness campaigns to show the communities that you can actually drink the water here and not have to worry. It's those kinds of considerations that we have to think about when we consider bringing folks who are fleeing places where it is uninhabitable to a place that's a little bit more inhabitable, but do so in such a way, again, that I said earlier, that isn't siloed, right? So we're also experiencing a housing challenge in Minneapolis. Very, very low supply is nowhere near meeting the demand of not only our regular population growth, but the anticipated population growth. And we're not even building enough units for the people that are already here. All across the city, we were at like a 98 or 99% vacancy rate before, or I should say 1% vacancy rate before the pandemic. As a result of the pandemic, people are further cash strapped, further cost burdened, are competing with outside developers who have cash, who are outbidding to the max for folks to even get their first homes. And so the pathway to building wealth is a challenge as well. And so as we work to make space, right, address our housing supply to accommodate the increased migration that we're going to see, we got to be working with our constituents and residents today to prepare them for that as well. It isn't just about the housing stock, and it isn't just about the infrastructure, and it isn't just about the adaptation or mitigation. There's a people side of this conversation. At a time where people are feeling like they're experiencing less, that they don't have the things that they need to put food on the table or to pay rent or what have you, they start to point to the other as the reason for why it looks that way. We have to do the job in government of preparing our constituents and our cities and our residents that, no, you're pointing at the wrong people here. That's not how we operate. And really make sure that we work to meet their needs so that as we increase demands on our system, demands on our resources, that we can do so in a way that prepares communities. We saw, for example, after the end of the war in Afghanistan, there were communities around Minneapolis, not in the city, but in the rural parts, that were saying no to more immigrants coming into town. And if we just approach this as, we got to make sure we have the right housing stock, we got to make sure that we meet the demands of housing, and we ignore that people side, it's going to make this a heck of a lot harder to do. And as we experience more climate impacts due to this climate emergency, we're going to be less able to then meet those demands if we don't start now planting the seed and getting communities ready today. The last thing I'll say on the opportunity side is we are very welcoming, and we have been for the last 20, 30 years, of new populations coming into Minneapolis. We've been working to prepare our transportation networks. We've been working to prepare even the developers and housing designers that, for example, Somali communities and Hmong communities, they told us that there could be upwards of 4 generations in one household. So we had to come up with different ways of designing homes and changing occupancy limits and changing land use policy to accommodate for that growth. In Minneapolis, we were one of the first cities, I think maybe the first city actually, to completely get rid of our single family home zoning designation in our land use policies. Before we did that, 75% of Minneapolis was zoned single family, which meant that if we were going to accommodate growth, it was concentrated into about 15 to 20% of the city, nowhere near enough space to accommodate natural growth as well as growth due to migration, due to climate change. By getting rid of that single family designation, now we can accommodate growth in 85 to 90% of the city, more density, et cetera, which is going to make it a lot easier to build those new housing models and to increase the density in our neighborhoods. So love that we did that a few years ahead of time, knowing that these changes were going to occur. And again, wanted to prepare the land use policies so that it can facilitate now the development of new housing stock and increasing that supply.
Thank you so much for that really rich answer, Ron. And I think, and thank you also to Minneapolis for the leadership on these changes in local housing and land use policy to increase the stock that you have. Lauren, I'd love to go to you to hear a little bit about the city's past experiences with climate migration and housing, and where you think that might be headed in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, New York City is so vast and complex. It feels like everything under the sun is happening all at once, all the time. Here in our city, we have 520 miles of coastline. That's more than several major cities combined. I want to say Miami, San Francisco, Boston, and Los Angeles. we have more coastline than all of those cities combined. And so that coastline is as diverse as our city, demographically speaking. There are communities that we might term as environmental justice communities that are exposed to pollution from flooding, pollution sources, especially during flooding. We have communities on the waterfront that are experiencing heat impacts as well. Last summer, there were some power outages due to heat events in our Rockaway Peninsula, which is vulnerable to both flooding and heat, where it took a little while for that power to come back online. We saw, there's also, I should mention as well, a vast diversity of housing stock. Everything from our massive public housing campuses, affordable housing campuses with thousands of residents in tall buildings, as well as low density communities, 1 to 4 family home communities as well across our coastline. We also have infrastructure, we also have industry on our coastline as well. And that's really where a lot of our mobility dialogues right now are focused. What we experienced in terms of housing mobility in the last 10 years, directly from extreme weather events, Sandy and Ida, include that, after Hurricane Sandy, which was a devastating event, storm surge up to 12 feet high, in places, in some of our peninsulas, the bays met the Atlantic Ocean. Folks were displaced from their own homes and from homes that they were renting for a good long while, and it took a lot to get folks back home. We are learning from that experience, and we're also fortunate as well in New York City within government to have a tremendous amount of capacity within our agencies, even though it doesn't always feel like that. And so some of our work at the mayor's office is, organizing agencies around the North Stars that we might direct our adaptation programs to, such as housing mobility. At the same time now, in the kind of bluer sky context, we are learning to name and face our histories and to acknowledge our present day realities, right? And so, for example, in New York City, Black home ownership went down after the 2009 financial crisis and never quite bounced back. The Black home ownership project, which is the work of the Center for New York City Neighborhoods here, has documented this and is, advancing the story that, all risks magnify upon each other. And so this is something to consider. The fact that 3 years after that, we had Sandy, that now we're in yet another economic recession. Some of our work on housing mobility really tapped into the very limited programs and policy tools that are at our disposal today. That includes, considering buyout programs, for example, as a form of down payment assistance that facilitates mobility to purchase or rent a new home. Considering the importance of moving and relocation benefits that are afforded under the Uniform Relocation Act, and that really only provide a limited amount of support for folks that are doing climate-driven moves. Some of these benefits can be carried into areas that are receiving communities, and some of them, like the place-based Section 8s, are harder to do. And so that's some of the landscape that we're working in, and we're really trying to wrap our heads around, what we can do today in the near term, but really what are the big transformations that we need to support housing mobility in the long term.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for those ideas and that reflection. I'd love to go to Lori for a question, and then try to take at least one audience question. We're running a little low on time, but I think, Lori, I'd love to hear from you. We heard from both Ron and Lauren about some of the key policies and programs that they think might have a role to play in supporting climate migrants. And I'm wondering if you might offer a couple other thoughts about housing policies and programs that you feel could help receiving communities prepare their housing stock and prepare, I guess, to speak to Ron's people side of things, help prepare our communities to be receiving communities.
Thank you. You know, when there's an event like a hurricane or a fire, it becomes an abrupt and disruptive and sudden scenario where people are forced out of their homes and forced to leave. You know, the 11,000 households that left Louisiana after Katrina occurred and went to Harris County, they ended up being sheltered in a stadium without support, without even the appropriate protection from those that should have been protecting the households, the families. You know, we heard of terrible things happening to women and children in the Astrodome. Houston was not prepared to deal with the influx. There was not enough housing. I think one of the worst scenarios that I became familiar with was the lack of support for those households, mainly communities of color, coming into Houston, and the amount of racism and the amount of violence with which they were treated. 12 years later, 7,000 households were abruptly displaced from Houston and Harris County and went back to New Orleans and went back to New York and went back to a lot of areas that folks had already flown 10 years before. It was an abrupt departure. So what I'm saying is, you know, this idea of a, you know, slow moving managed retreat, I don't agree that that's actually a reality. I think people don't want to leave their homes, especially if you are, you know, a multi-generational homeowner. You know, your grandmother may have owned that home. It may have been in the floodplain, because guess what? That's what the cheapest land was. My family, Jews in Atlanta, they had a house that was right on the highway in a floodplain in Atlanta, and they were pushed out. That was the cheapest land they could get. So there's no way they wanted to leave that home. People don't want to leave their homes easily, especially if there's nowhere to go to. I work deeply in Puerto Rico, and this is the case. So I reject the notion that, you know, it's going to be an easy, seamless scenario, especially when there's nowhere to go. So for me, what we need to do is start identifying what our 50 to 100-year game plan is for this nation to ensure that we fortify communities that are safe from floods and fires and hazards, have an appropriate housing plan in place that's affordable, make sure that those Section 8 vouchers can be transferred between states, make sure that we've got fortifications upland, and that there are places to receive communities that are traumatized by these disasters and should not be moving into communities and experiencing more violence. And all we have to do, and I'll close right here, is look at what's going on around the globe. 23 million individuals displaced from climate and violence resulting from climate and natural resource displacement. And look where they're ending up. People are drowning in the ocean. They're living on the border in unsafe conditions. All we have to do is turn to our global partners and look at the disaster that's happening around the world and say to ourselves, what are we going to do here in the United States to make sure this does not happen?
Lori, thank you so much for centering the real human toll that could of not planning ahead and of not preparing our nation for the needs of all of these people. Oh, did you have something else?
So I just want to say
please.
one thing. The second part of that, which was what are the solutions? Fortifying faith-based communities to receive, fortifying cultural associations in communities so that they're able to prepare and receive their compatriots, right? Their communities, because we see in the communities where it works well, where the receiving community is prepared, is when there is a strong network with which to be received into. So let us not forget the importance of those associations.
I love that, Lori, that idea of thinking about, you know, what are the pre-existing communities? What is the net that is going to catch people when they move?
Yes.
You know, how can we anticipate that people will be moving in with their kin networks? And so if you're a Puerto Rican diaspora and you're moving to join your family in New York City, or in Florida, how can we think about helping those family members be ready to receive this extra person who might, be moving in onto a couch? I think that's so important. I would love to take just one audience question with our remaining time, and I think, just to look across them, one thing I'm seeing is people are really curious how to move beyond cities, and I know we have 2 city policymakers here today, but I'm thinking about, is in the face of increased urbanization and these, greater movement of people potentially in the future, are there ways to pull on the surrounding regions of our cities to, help people move there who, where people are needed and where there's kind of been a depletion of people from these areas? So do you see your cities collaborating with communities in the surrounding region to address housing needs, and especially in these kind of acute climate events? And how could you do more of that in the future?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that one. That's a really great question. So Minnesota's not very big. We have a state probably 5.5 to 6 million people statewide, about 3.5 million in our metropolitan area. So that means there's a lot of space to accommodate people. The challenge is for us in the city, we have very, very, very pro-migration laws, right? Sanctuary city type kind of laws where we will facilitate, we will provide resources, all those other things. And there are even some cities that are our neighbors that don't even have a similar kind of parity as it relates to some of those laws. So when I think about partnership, yes, definitely city to city partnerships, but I think that's what's kind of undersold in all of this is, on the one hand, our cities and our cities' economies are these like densely woven tapestries, these laboratories of innovation. But during this pandemic, our local government resources have been limited. We're relying a lot on federal investment from ARP funds and other things. And so beyond going from city to city and figuring out what the strategy is, I actually argue that we need a multi-sector kind of strategic partnerships with nonprofits, foundations, corporations, CDFIs, and others to really aid in this challenge and addressing some of these housing needs. And then we need those partnerships. This is probably the most important piece to this. We need those partnerships to last and extend far beyond the moment in time that we're in. So we have these episodic displays of collaboration during times of emergency and during times of stress and trauma, but then those things go away once things get back to okay. Right. And we need to maintain these partnerships, knowing that we're going to have these cascading shocks, right? Recognizing that, cities can't do this work alone. We have to create the access points so that more sectors and more partners can aid in building that resiliency, particularly around housing and accommodating against those shocks, and really communicating that as a city, our collaboration is our competitive advantage, that we actually solve our problems more quickly and more effectively by positioning our communities to thrive in the face of these things. So we actually need to be going to our communities and asking the question, what does it look like to actually shape your own neighborhood? Recognizing that we have these challenges coming down the pike. How do we activate partners and how do we prioritize collaboration? I see my role as a chief resilience officer is just kind of the tip of the resilience spear, but the rest of the spear is made up of all those partners, community, et cetera. And really what we do as a city and what I do in this role is convene the partners and help set the agenda. But ultimately the work has to be shared. So I actually encourage us to go beyond government to government, city to city, and actually go sector to sector and come up with the strategies. Because guess what? Minneapolis is, home to the highest concentration per capita of Fortune 500 companies in the country. That's a lot of partners and a lot of opportunities and a lot of people who have actually benefited from the environment that our government has helped create. And all I'm asking for is a little bit of value capture, a little bit of return on some of that investment. That if Target, for example, has been a great partner, if they have so many wonderful, talented employees, largely because of the work that we've done in the city, I am asking that you also invest back into that environment so that you help us in solving our biggest problems, not just regulatory, but we can get innovative about how private sector can actually help create space for new housing models or increased housing supply or facilitating engagement or any of these other things. And far too often we leave them on the sidelines and not actually aid in their help. So I push for a more multi-sectoral collaborative approach to building resilience, because we're not going to be able to do it on our own.
I'd like to.
You can squeeze in one last word, but I need to then wrap us up, Lori. Thank you.
I just want to plus it with what Ron said, and let us not forget about the third sector, which is the NGOs and the nonprofits that are the critical linchpins for so much recovery and so much mitigation. And they are undersourced, underfunded, overburdened. We need to ask our NGOs as well to think about themselves as stewards and firehouses for these efforts. And so we really need to make sure that they have the support they need, because they're trusted partners in communities.
Thank you so much for that reminder about the critical role of these other sectors. I just wanted to say I feel so inspired by some of these ideas that you're offering about that we don't have time to kind of wrap up in this session, but we do have a housing breakout group later today. And I'd love for all of our commenters to join that and bring your great ideas. I heard Lauren talking about how can we create a more just city in this process, and by trying to increase Black home ownership and home ownership more broadly. How can we create denser cities that are more livable and more walkable in this process of accepting migrants? And so I think I would just hope that we can focus on the potential cities that we can create and regions that we can create in the future. So thank you so much to you three for your great ideas today. And we'll look forward to more great discussion for the rest of the day.
Thank you so much, Osamo, and thank you to everyone in the housing panel, Lauren, Ron, and Laurie. That was a great session. I just want to let everyone know that despite the fact that you posted questions that we may not have gotten to, the breakout rooms would be an excellent opportunity to bring those up during the activity. And with that being said, I also want to remind everyone on the call, especially for people who have just joined, that the breakout sessions would be based on your interest in either a housing conversation, infrastructure conversation, or labor conversation. So please include a H before your name. So just rename yourself, put a H before your name, an IN in case you're interested in infrastructure, or L in case you're interested in labor, and we'll make sure to put you in those groups after. So I want to transition to the infrastructure panel right now. We're going to be talking about infrastructure needs to support climate and migration. We have an excellent lineup as well. Through this session, we're trying to get perspectives from researchers, practitioners, or community members. And so you have those reflected in the conversations today. I would like to introduce Bill Schleizer. Bill is going to be moderating this session on infrastructure. Bill currently serves as a CEO at Delta Institute, where he drives organization strategy, development, and engagement in support of the nonprofit's mission to collaborate with communities across the Midwest to solve complex environmental challenges, which is currently focused on nature-based climate solutions. Bill has a bachelor's degree in ecology, evolution, and organismal biology and environmental studies from Tulane University, and a master's degree in environmental analysis and decision-making from Rice University. Please, Bill, you're welcome to take over the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. And hello, everybody. I'm super excited to be moderating this panel. We have some great panelists, and the last panel was just phenomenal too. And I can't wait for the breakout sessions later. So infrastructure is having a moment. It used to be boring. It used to be plug and play, but now we're actually considering it and the importance that it plays both in communities and equity in climate and now taking into this new variable of really thinking about climate migration. A couple years ago, I asked our regional planning organization here in the Chicago area, what were they doing in their 2050 long-range planning to take into account the impacts of climate and potential migration? And I was told, what are you talking about? Our population is going to decline. I'm like, oh, okay, this is like my rut-row moment. So I'm really excited that we have all the folks engaged in this work, thinking through the implications that we need to be dealing with, not only with infrastructure, but also infrastructure and climate, and adding in migration to make sure that we are understanding what do we have, what do we need to know, and how do we get those questions answered? How do we continue to center this around equity and community and those most impacted both by climate and climate migration that will be happening around throughout the Great Lakes region? And how do we take into account, how do we integrate this into partnerships and planning and policy making? So we are joined today by three amazing panelists who will start us off on this conversation together from different perspectives. We have Dr. Missy Stoltz, who is the Sustainability and Innovations Manager from the City of Ann Arbor. Who'll be talking about it with her work, as a community, as a representative of a municipality that works both in government, but then across the region. We have Kathy Bunting-Howarth who's the Associate Director from New York Sea Grant, really getting into what is happening around research and what information are we generating that will help us think through infrastructure and what it means for climate migration. And finally, from a community perspective, we have Ricky Ackerman, who's the Director of Climate Equity for the Detroit Eastside Community Network, really thinking about community development, the impacts of climate on that local level. And how do we bring all these perspectives to the table to really think through these issues of migration, its impact on infrastructure? And it's having a moment, and we're talking about it a lot, and there could be some dollars on the table from what I'm hearing about this. How do we utilize all what's happening in this dynamic environment to make this happen for the Great Lakes so that we can really be set up for future scenarios as well? So I'm going to toss it over to each of our panelists for just a quick introduction. While we have their titles and what they formally do, every one of these people wears several different hats. So feel free to take just a short time to talk about what you actually do versus what your title might be. So I'll start with Missy.
Thank you so much, Phil, and thank you all you glorious human beings for being with us for this panel. I hope your tummy is digesting a delicious breakfast or lunch, and we're excited to talk about infrastructure with you. So for a quick moment, I get to do all things climate, equity, justice kind of within the city. So my job is to help our community achieve what we call A20. It's our plan, our strategy, and our framework for how we're going to become completely decarbonized as an entire community by 2030. And resilience is not optional, right? Climate impacts are already here. We're already experiencing them. For us, that's increased precipitation most acutely. We've had a 44% increase in annual precipitation falling on the city. That's a lot. If any of you have ever been to Michigan football stadium, go blue, largest football stadium in America, that's the equivalent of 23 more Michigan stadiums full of water falling on our city every year. That's the largest stadium in America, friends. There's a lot of water that is falling on our city, and we're already experiencing that now. Add to that we experience a 37% increase in the amount of rain that falls during extreme events, right? So extremes are more extreme, and we have more rain that's falling, and it's falling in shorter periods of time. We already have these direct impacts. So I get to work on how we're building resilience within our infrastructure. And I mean that physical infrastructure, green infrastructure, social infrastructure, cultural infrastructure. It's a lot bigger than a simple fix. We all know that here. Obviously, we're concerned about heat too. But in the course of this discussion, and I've only been with the city for 3.5 years, but I've lived here for a lot longer. One of the things that dawned on me pretty quick was we have a lot of water. We have water. We have water, right? And that is life in this work. And so part of what I get to do is work with different folks to say, how are we preparing ourselves to be a receiving zone? How are we making sure infrastructure investments, again, across that whole spectrum, are not just for today or population projections for the future, but are integrating climate change into that? And guess what? Uncertainty, go with it every day. So that's something that we've got some projects going on and happy to talk a little bit about. But I get to be really creative and think outside the box and cry a lot during my work and get really excited and give high fives and do everything you can possibly imagine, because this is a really great, terrible, awful run, no good, very bad, exciting job. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Missy. Yeah, it's all the emotions when we're talking about community infrastructure and climate. That is absolutely for sure. And one thing about water, and we are blessed with it in this region, but it just happens to always be in the wrong place at the wrong time in the wrong quantities, drought, flood, everything in between. And how do we deal with that from an infrastructure standpoint? Because, my office right here is on the Chicago River. I get to watch when the infrastructure fails physically and the river floods and starts flowing the right way, which is the wrong way, from an infrastructure perspective. Ricky, let's hear from you. Let's talk about the work that you do, on the community basis in Detroit.
Thanks, Bill. Great to see you, Missy. My name is Ricky Ackerman. I'm the Director of Climate Equity for Eastside Community Network. And we're a community development organization based on the east side of Detroit. And so what I get to do is really across the spectrum of environmental issues. We kind of about 3 years ago realized how people on the east side really weren't aware of what was going on with climate change, weren't really talking about climate change, at least in that terminology, right? There's a lot of issues on the east side. We have air quality problems, we have flooding problems. So people knew about those, but they didn't necessarily connect it to our changing climate and how this could get worse in the future. And so what we've really been doing is trying to build the capacity of our resident leaders. That we're a community-driven organization. We have residents based on all of our committees, in all of our meetings. We're really trying to work with the community to develop approaches and strategies around the issues that they're facing and the needs that they have. So what we've been trying to add to the conversation is how do we prepare for what's coming while dealing with what's already occurring? And so it's educating people around these climate issues, impacts. We've been looking a lot at high heat and flooding, because those are going to be the primary concerns for Detroiters. We're currently developing a wellness hub, which is going to be a resilience hub mixed with resources for a holistic wellness approach. And we're working with the city and other community organizations on developing other resilience hubs with the idea of forming a network across the city. We're also currently working on a lot of initiatives around flooding. A lot of people probably have heard about Detroit experienced really high rates of flooding this summer, tens of thousands of homes from degraded infrastructure, which we'll get more into. So we really just pivoted this summer to help people with claims forms, help people get the resources they need. We handed out flooding kits, and just talking to people, because it's a very traumatic experience, and people had other issues going on top of the flooding they were experiencing. And the last thing they really had time and focus to do is fill out a lengthy government form to get a little bit of money to help them get a furnace. And so we also have a sustainability fellows program, which is something that really excites me, because that is directly about building the capacity in our community leaders. A lot of people have been hustling in their communities to get projects in the ground, to educate their neighbors, get people the resources they need for a long time, but they really haven't been invested in to build their leadership skills, build their connections and networks, and then finance to do projects. So it's a program where we go through a series of classes, we bring in experts from different technical areas, and then we give small grant funds so they can actually implement a sustainability project in their neighborhood. So we're just trying to invest in people on top of the buildings and implementation projects that we're doing ourselves. And I'll end there.
Thanks, Ricky. Yeah, I mean, we talk about the natural and the hard infrastructure, but the critical piece of the people and social, cultural infrastructure is definitely something that has to be built, in parallel with all of this. So having that perspective coming from the communities, how do we utilize that to move that forward is super important. And next up is Kathy, who helps get us all the information and data and things that we need to solve all these critical questions around infrastructure. So Kathy, how do you tackle this particularly complex topic around climate migration and the impacts?
Oh, thank you, Bill. But you make me feel like a lot of people are going to ask me a lot of questions that I really don't have the answer to. I'm with New York Sea Grant, which is one of 34 programs across the country. It's a collaboration between the federal government and universities. And our goal is to fund research of relevance to coastal communities. And then we have an extension staff that gets that information out into the communities. So we want to fund things that are relevant for people that they can use. And so we've been working in the climate space for over 10 years now, really trying to build capacity. Being in New York, it's great because you have both the Great Lakes and you have the Marine Coast. So I've had the pleasure of working with some communities and having staff that's working a lot with those communities on Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, as well as doing more work in the city, Long Island, and the Hudson Valley. Currently, what's probably most relevant to this group is I'm a member of a team on a NSF Research Coordination Network grant called People on the Move in a Changing Climate, where we're holding regional workshops to build networks and document research, data, outreach, and policy needs. So it's been great listening in yesterday and today to really continue to build those needs out. We held a Northeast Mid-Atlantic meeting virtually in September, and the next meeting up to be held is on in 2022 in Buffalo to focus on the Great Lakes. So please visit the website if you're interested in any of the regional networks. There's a space for you to put in your name. So please do. And for those of you who might be interested in the Northeast or Mid-Atlantic, we have started a LinkedIn group. And so you can join that. And when we have the workshop report ready, we'll post it both on the website and on LinkedIn. So the other thing that I've been working on is climate and adaptation resilience issues. I led scenario thinking exercises back in 2011, 2012 on Lake Ontario, where the real uncertainties were, is climate going to be wetter or is it going to be drier? And we now know that we have a likely chance of being wetter and drier in New York. When we're wetter, we're wetter. When we're drier, we're drier. The other push was population change. Are we going to grow? Are we going to stay the same? Are we going to reduce population? So it's really interesting that now we're really looking at our Great Lakes communities as communities that might grow, which makes some of the findings from those exercises a little bit more relevant these days. Even though back in 2011, a lot of people thought we were being a little crazy with some of our stories about 2030. The other thing that I've been helping our team with is some community science work in the Jamaica Bay watershed of New York City, where residents are collecting their own data of flood, and we share them with Lauren's group at the New York's, the Mayor's Office of Resilience and Recovery. And so as part of that, we did a pilot social science study on how these communities actually live with all this water. So it's nuisance flooding, it's flooding that's going to increase with sea level rise. What are people doing now to change that? They move their car, right? You leave early for work or you come home late. You have to keep boots in your car. The city has to change the trash collection schedule. So that's generally what I do in a little bit more detail of where we're working with communities on this issue in particular. So thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. And as you all can tell, we have a variety of perspectives touching several different levels of how you deal with infrastructure and community. So we're going to get into some questions. I just want to do a quick plug for Buffalo first. It's one of my favorite cities in the Great Lakes region for a variety of reasons, but I'm like a weather geek. And if you want to experience real weather coming across the Great Lakes, go to Buffalo in the summer, in the winter. Yeah, it's reinvigorating to see weather at its most extreme, really, when it comes across. So let's get into the questions now. So we have a couple questions, but definitely use the Slido to ask these great experts about infrastructure and climate migration, and we'll get to those at the end. But we're talking about infrastructure. It's something, you know, that's on everybody's lips. We've got dollars for it right now. So when you're thinking about Great Lakes needs for infrastructure and how we might be thinking about the climate migration, what types of infrastructure, what sort of intervention should we really be thinking about investing in first? What are our priorities? So I don't know, I think did Missy drop, but we'll start with Ricky. So from your perspective, from the community, where do you think we should really be prioritizing investment now?
Yeah, and I mean, going off what I said earlier too, water is like the really easy one, both, you know, drinking water infrastructure. I know there's a lot of national attention to the issues that went on in Flint. Those problems haven't gone away. We still have this, Benton Harbor is experiencing very similar issues. And PFAS has been pretty prominent in the state of Michigan as well as elsewhere in the Great Lakes. But speaking specifically for Detroit, because that's really where my experience is, the stormwater infrastructure is not adequate to deal with the problems we have now. And we know it's going to get worse, and it hasn't been adequate to deal with even 10 years ago. You know, we've been experiencing flooding significantly for the last several years, both from overbank flooding from the Detroit River in 2019 and 2020. It was at its historically high levels and was impacting neighborhoods along that shoreline. But this past summer, the storms we experienced were mostly basement backups. So they weren't from high water levels on the river. They were from the infrastructure failing and not being able to withhold the capacity of rain that was coming in. So our stormwater infrastructure is wildly inadequate to deal with the population we have now. So thinking about the prospects of more people coming in, which Detroit's been trying to, switch to a growing population for a long time, because it continues to decrease in population. But that is a huge problem to overcome, because if we can't deal with what we have now, I can't imagine what's going to happen as we add more people. We have a lot of vacancy right now, a lot of vacant lots, which is probably helping make things less bad. But if we start building up again, then it's going to lead to more problems. And I'll say just an important point with this too is that inadequate infrastructure disproportionately impacts people who can't afford to deal with the problems associated with it. So we have people being displaced because their basements are flooding, or because they can't afford to maintain the other costs that are associated with the problems that we're facing. So while it's easy to think about like water infrastructure, and I would throw in electrical infrastructure too, because we have unreliable power and some of the slowest reconnection rates in the country. But we need to make sure we invest in the people that are here, the people who can't afford to confront these problems themselves, because otherwise we're going to end up with more displacement of people that have been in these communities for a long time.
And Kathy, you've also been doing a lot of research with communities and stakeholders around both, what's important to them and migration. Where are you seeing like most critical infrastructure investments right now?
So I would have to agree with Ricky in terms of stormwater, green infrastructure. There's been a lot of desire to look at natural and nature-based shorelines as part of that green infrastructure to protect from rising waters, as well as provide other ecological functions, as well as social and cultural functions. I would add that transportation is extremely important. I think, and you think of Sea Grant, you think of healthy coastal ecosystems and water quality and fish, but you don't think of transportation. And I think Hurricane Sandy really, it became increasingly important for me and for our programming after Hurricane Sandy, understanding how people could not get to work. Public transportation wasn't there. The roads were covered with water for days. Transportation is going to be really important in receiving areas as well, because public transportation will be integral for getting people to work, from work, in a way that's climate sensitive, but yet we don't want to have gentrification occur, because neighborhoods that were maybe not as popular because they had a lack of public transportation are now having that. So I would add to Ricky's list, transportation.
Yeah, and making sure that those communities that have already been impacted from infrastructure decisions don't continue to be, I think, is a really important, critical part of this, thinking through how do we deal with this in future scenarios as well.
And to add on, I know I just saw a news alert today that with the infrastructure bill, for the first time, the federal government is investing money to demolish freeways and rebuild streets, parks, and other infrastructure destroyed by legacy highway construction. And so as those dollars become available, it's going to be important for people on the ground to actually work collaboratively with various groups to figure out how to best invest those funds in order to provide prepare for both climate and migration, as well as increasing the resilience and increasing equity and climate justice issues.
Mm-hmm. And Missy, I know you're doing obviously a lot of work around this, both with the transportation and water, like we've been talking about. What other infrastructure investments do you think are critical right now?
Yeah, that's such a huge question, because the answer is all. but I'll try to like piece it because it can feel very, very overwhelming to sort of take it from that perspective. One, we've kind of said this implicitly, but I'm going to make it explicit that at the local level, you don't have the luxury of thinking about adaptation or mitigation or equity. You have to think about all of them, right? Like all of that it's all intersecting deeply in this work. And so as I'm thinking about how I'm going to help people retrofit and stay in their homes, who are we centering in that work, right? Low income and energy burdened households. And if I figure out how to do that in a way that also manages energy resilience, because our grid goes down, right? We're in the same region, Ricky and I are sitting here, our grid stinks. Our grid stinks for different reasons. Ours is old and we're electrifying fast and the grid can't handle it, right? So investments, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars or investments are going to go into like really traditional infrastructure. I think that's a bad bet. I think it's a really bad bet. I think we need to be investing in non-poles and wire solutions because that big grid still vulnerable. High wind speeds, extreme events, it's going to take it down. So it doesn't matter how hard you make that grid, we are still going to have outages. So why aren't we investing in solar and storage solutions and making sure those are accessible to a wide group of people? And so the fight, this is such a non sequitur, my head is everywhere. The fight that I get to go in is not just with the market, it's with incumbent utilities, it's with regulators, it's trying to figure out forces that don't support low income households, but yet we have market rate things that people can access. And so the points of intervention are so many and complicated and fun. So yeah, we need infrastructure investments in our energy grid, we need transportation infrastructure, think about water treatment, water quality. That's the one that sort of got my community talking because we're going to invest in a new water treatment plant, which is it's got a long life, and we could make it climate smart. I live in a community where we already are planning for physical changes in climate. Like that's a given. It's non-optional to build if you're not looking at changing stormwater profiles in our community. That's easy. You can still undersize it if we're not planning for more people being in the region, demand on it, right? We fail as well if we're not doing migration. So that's how we sort of got kind of in migration in the discussion. Green infrastructure, but then the softer infrastructure, I hate the word soft because it implies squishy. It's just not. I think the more complicated infrastructure, the cultural and the social infrastructure that we have to build, right? How do you invest in, oh my gosh, I'm rambling, I'm sorry. Last piece. Invest in neighborhoods and neighborhood social cohesion and resilience. Ricky talked about resilience hubs. We have a resilience hub. We're working on 2 and 3 right now. And how do we make sure that neighbors take care of neighbors in a disaster? Because in a real disaster, your government's not going to be there for everybody at the same moment, right?
Yeah.
So you have to think about all that.
And that's exactly where you have an intersection with the previous conversation with housing. How do you set up communities and the infrastructure and housing in ways that all work together to be resilient? And how are we moving forward our communities to be more adaptive? But now you kind of mentioned it in your comments, Missy, as well. Let's talk about mitigation, and infrastructure has, opportunity for mitigation. So where can we also, as we're planning for climate migration and changing our infrastructure for that, can we bring down the climate intensity of what we're doing infrastructure-wise? I think that there's some natural ways to do that, and I'd love to hear from the 3 of you where you think mitigation can really be a part of the solution as we move forward on infrastructure. Kathy, I'll start with you on this one.
So mitigation is not my strong suit, but I will share that our average office building temperature supports wearing suits in the summer and maybe just a light shirt in the winter. And so the idea that we adjust some of our cultural norms, like, do we really need to wear a lot of clothing in summer and not a lot in the winter? Like, to the extent that we can bring down energy bills that way, have fleets that are electric vehicles. Although I still want to find out more about the batteries and the deep sea minerals that are mined for those batteries.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like Ricky and Missy might be better to answer this mitigation question.
No, you started us off really well. So Ricky, I'll toss it over to you. Where do you see us being able to deal with climate mitigation?
Yeah, and I think Missy was kind of touching on this too. I think it's really looking for the overlaps of how we can build resilience and mitigate at the same time. So I think solar, and I think, solar like on homes, especially because that's building resilience on the grid, but it's also reducing the emissions that we have. It's really frustrating because our utility is very against that idea of any investment in that sort of infrastructure. But I think I think that's a major one, because it also, living in a city where we have a high rate of poverty, it's another way to invest in a community and reduce utility costs, which keep going up and up and up, even though we're not getting any greener in how we're producing the energy. And then I think transportation is the other big sector for mitigation. I think Detroit is a very car city. The public transportation has not been invested in, and Kathy touched on that very well, on the overall landscape of that. So I think that's another big opportunity where if we can start to do better planning around public transit and get it to be more accessible and more effective, that's going to be a big reduction in our emissions as well.
Thanks, Ricky. And Missy, finally, I mean, you had already touched upon like electrification is happening. That is a climate mitigation strategy, but we don't have the infrastructure really for that. What else are you doing, or besides fighting with the utilities and coming up with, fun conversations with those folks and policymakers to deal with mitigation in Ann Arbor?
That is a bigger question, and I'll drop something in the chat to point people to. We're actively working on 34 different initiatives around mitigation, adaptation, and equity on our team. So there's a lot. I think what I want to share just briefly is what is different for those in the mitigation space is historically we've always started with energy waste reduction or energy efficiency because it makes sense, right? It makes economic sense. It's about safety. It's about health. It's about comfort in your home, and many of us are just wasting. We're literally paying money to heat and cool the outdoors, and that doesn't make sense, right? So we need to have better envelopes and better buildings. But what is different in this moment is you can't just do that. You have to do it all, right? Like you also have to think about electrification. But in where I sit, if I electrify buildings, rates go up, right? Because electric is so expensive. So that's why we have to pair with efficiency. And then solar and potential storage in site means you're getting grid resilience, and you're actually now investing in the clean energy economy and reaping those benefits. So we're working on an initiative in one of our neighborhoods. It's our largest census tract of low income BIPOC residents. And we are working to make them the first decarbonized community in America. And we're fundraising, all the money stays in the neighborhood. The neighbors are designing what home comfort and assessments look like based on their needs. And it's all the things we think about, but it's also looking at radon because that's a concern. And it is looking at stormwater issues. And they want fruit trees because they want to be able to walk, and kids to pick up things. And so how do we sort of do this in a way that really is centering the neighborhood and leveraging the expertise that we can bring in? And public transit is an important piece, but another piece is GASP. You have to be able to walk and bike to places you want to go. So it doesn't matter if your grocery store is 5 miles away, you are not going to walk and bike 5 miles. The vast majority, maybe the people on this line will, but the vast majority of people won't. So we need to change our land use policies to make sure you can get where you want to go and also you can live where you want to live. I don't need everyone to live in Ann Arbor, but you can't live in Ann Arbor right now. We are so expensive and we are so single family home centric in terms of what we prioritize in our land use pattern. We really have to evaluate that and disrupt some of those things. Last point on that though is our entire wealth accumulation system for the vast majority of us though is tied into this building that many of us are sitting in, right? So there's a tension there. It's not as simple as and just do away with zoning, single family zoning. I mean, maybe it is, but don't tell anyone in Ann Arbor that that's true yet. But we have to deal with that conflict that this is so many of our retirements in one.
So we have like a minute left and I have 7,000 other questions. So we're gonna have really great activity in the breakout session. So folks that were asking questions or have comments or feedback or other ideas, be ready for those breakout sessions that are gonna be coming later today. But I just wanna give you all a chance to talk about, you were talking about a little bit, Missy, with this innovative program in the community for decarbonized community. How do we build those partnerships? What do we need to think about with equity and partnerships dealing with community-based infrastructure and climate? Is there anything that you have learned from your engagements, the three of you, that's most important for other people to take into consideration? Ricky, I'll start with you.
Yeah, and these are all like giant questions.
Yeah, like a whole session on themselves. You get like 30 seconds.
Yeah, well, and I'll say, and I'm biased, but I think it's investing in the organizations that are on the ground and in the communities. I think. And I'm thinking of FEMA this summer, coming in with their resources and how inadequate and inefficient it is. But I think it's getting money to people who are working with these communities already, working with people who need more support, who need home repairs, who can electrify their furnaces when they're upgrading it after it was destroyed by flooding. But putting that money closer to the community level so that it can go to the needs of people That for equity, that's huge right now in Detroit, that we really need money to go to homeowners so they can remain homeowners and be prepared for climate change without being displaced from where they're at.
Thank you for that. And one thing that we've done actually at Delta, I'll just add this really quickly, is, we've changed how we do community engagement. Instead of being extractive of the information, really being more engaging and centering on the community as the leader and expert, and paying them for their time. That's something that, we're asking for their time and resources, but it's always on a free or volunteer basis. So thinking through the value of the community members as those folks that are most important to these processes is really important. I'm going to wrap us up. Thank you so much to our three panelists, Missy, Ricky, and Kathy. Man, we could have like 7 more hours at least for this topic, but infrastructure, you put an IN in your name, and we will see you at the breakout sessions later. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. That was such an excellent session. Thanks, Bill, for facilitating that session, and to all the speakers. So right now we're going to go on a 5-minute break. Please be back at 1:32. When we come back, we're going to go into the labor panel and hear from different speakers. You can also change your Zoom name to reflect your interest for the breakout rooms. So if you want to be in the infrastructure panel, infrastructure breakout room, just put an IN in front of your name. If you want to be in the labor, put an L. And if you want to be in the housing, put a H. And we'll be sure to assign you to those breakout rooms. I would like to welcome you all to the last panel for the day, which is labor needs to support climate in migration. And during this panel, you'll be hearing from Maddie, and you'll be hearing from Brian, and Rachel Parrish will be moderating the session. So Rachel is an executive director of Welcoming America. Inspired by her family's refugee story and by the worldwide movement of welcomers, Rachel works to create communities where all residents, including immigrants and refugees, can thrive and belong. Since joining the organization in 2021, she has served as the organization's deputy director and in other senior leadership roles, helping to grow Welcoming America from a startup to an award-winning organization with a global footprint. Welcome, Rachel, and we hope that you would enjoy the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you, ASAP, for having me and our panelists today. I will be introducing them in a moment, but just to kick off our session here, I know that we are talking today about labor needs to support climate in migration, although I suspect for many of you, this panel could be reversed in its title as climate in migration to support labor needs. And I think in our conversation today, I'm hoping we can take a comprehensive view of what that means. And I'll say just in the early conversations that I had with our panelists today, I was really excited to hear about some of the thoughtful ways, collaborative ways, and really values-oriented ways that communities are beginning to come at this challenge. And I know that within our own work here at Welcoming America, working with about 300 members in the United States and globally, that there really is this imperative to begin thinking about and to deepen the work that's needed in communities around what we call welcoming infrastructure, which is really this set of things that encompasses a number of topics that I heard come up in the last session around social infrastructure, equity, a really comprehensive approach to adaptation when our communities are maybe more racially and ethnically diverse than they have been in the past, or simply a more proactive view around what the implications of demographic change are in a variety of different ways, from civic participation to social participation, and of course to economic participation. So I am just excited to get into this with our two panelists today. We are missing today, unfortunately, Megan Dayton with the Minnesota State Demographic Center is unable to join us. But that gives us an intimate group here for the conversation with Brian Patham with SEMCOG and with Marty Gerentzer with the West Michigan Food Processing Association. And it's great to be with you both. And maybe we can just start off with a little bit of a landscape of what you're seeing in your current roles around current gaps. What are you observing about what is missing and what needs to get prioritized in this moment? Maybe Marty, we can start with you.
Sure. So I'm Marty Garenser, Executive Director of the West Michigan Food Processing Association. We'll share more, but essentially we focus on healthy foods and sustainable practices in the food industry on the west side of Michigan, but throughout the state. So of course, labor needs are huge. And we need people. There aren't enough people in the state of Michigan to fill all of these labor needs. And we have found a very collaborative approach, a supportive system, a cultural, social infrastructure has been successful on the west side in helping our citizens and those moving into the state adapt to the way we live in Michigan and the way that work is done and the training that is needed. So I can share more as we go through the process.
Great, thank you, Marty. Brian, how about for you?
Yeah, sure. So first, I just want to say SEMCOG, who I work for, is a regional planning partnership of local governments that encompass the 7-county Southeast Michigan region. And our work strives to improve the quality of life in the region through transportation planning, economic development, and environmental planning. And I work in our data analysis area where I study the region's economic trends. The data that my colleagues and myself work on provides the foundation for our policies and decision making. And in terms of labor force, we have a couple things. One, we have a 30-year forecast that predicts the population and including working age population and employment change by community. We have done numerous studies on our labor market as well, such as labor force participation, vulnerable workers, and remote workers. And through both of these, we've been able to identify some gaps as it relates to what the demands are for labor, as well as just what some of the models' abilities are as well for modeling climate and migration. So I guess I can talk a little bit more about that later, but a lot of the data work that we do feeds into our policymaking and for a lot of our planning work overall as an agency.
Well, maybe we can just pick up on that, Brian, and can you share with us some of what your data is telling you right now?
Sure. So a couple things. So two things on the gaps. One, for our forecast. So like I said, we do a 30-year forecast once every 5 years. And it looks at the outlook of population and employment growth by community. The model that we use, at least for the county level, higher level model, is called the Remy Model. And it looks at economic and demographic changes, the economic and demographic effects of policy changes. So for example, how would total employment and population change if we increase the share of financial services relative to the national average? Now the challenge here with this model is that it has difficulty predicting migration scenarios that are not based on economic policy decisions. So climate change, for instance, would be a challenge. Migration due to climate change is going to be a challenge for it to predict. And being able to fully implement this sort of a scenario is going to require a significant amount of research. But we are exploring it for the longer term for future forecasts. So the gap in this sense is technical in nature. But then the other gap that I want to talk about is that we discovered, it's a gap that we discovered through our data analysis. And this was before, just before COVID, we did a study on the labor force participation rate for our region. And we compared it to the 10 other major Midwest metro areas to see how it ranked. And we found that our participation rate was the lowest among all among all major Midwest areas. We came in at 62%, where the median of the other metro areas was right around 66%. And actually the highest was Minneapolis at 72%. Now at the same time, employers were looking for workers. And there's a lot of talk of labor shortages nowadays, but actually the labor shortages began before COVID started. So there was clearly something going on here. There was a mismatch. Why do we have so many employers looking for workers, but yet we have low participation rates? So we did an analysis to try to better understand what factors impacted the labor force participation. And we found that increasing the share of the working age population, along with the share of population with a bachelor's degree, increased participation rates. And then we also found that metros with larger shares of population with a disability, along with larger shares of single parent households, tended to lower participation rates. So this led us to recommending the increase in educational attainment for our population, along with attracting more working age people, improving job accessibility for people with disabilities, and increasing support services like childcare.
Well, that's great. And I want to come back to some of those gaps and what that all means for your work or your recommendations for others. But Marty, can you share more from an employer perspective on that gap and what you're finding is challenging in the current moment?
Sure. It is new news to a lot of folks that there's a real need for food industry workers that are technically trained, either a 2-year degree, 4-year, or beyond. And there are living wage with 401ks, with health benefits, well into 6-figure jobs needed. This isn't really just about seasonal workers. And this is all over the state of Michigan. This isn't just the West Side, but we are particularly focused on the West Side. So as folks come in and want to get that technical training, there are so many other needs that we sort of set up cultural counselor type organizations to help them become acclimated to the area. Their housing, of course, and their community and their closeness of those that they might know in the community versus setting them in an apartment where they may be remote and very far away from the resources they need. Certainly schools, healthcare, churches or places of worship, or some type of a community center where they can start to socialize and feel a part of community. Certainly shopping and transportation, fire and hospitals, those types of things. The parks, the help with language barriers, those types of government services we talked about earlier as climate change impacts our people and they're in a new state or in a new location within the state. What do they do when they need those resources? And then certainly we work a lot in the rural areas, of course, with our food industry and our farmers. And internet, of course, is getting better, but still just a huge issue for our children and our adults and our families and our, and working from home. I literally have to be on one computer and nothing else going on, make sure the TV isn't on or anything else when we're doing webinars or we've been kicked off before. And so really giving them the resources that they need from a holistic approach, looking at what the whole person needs and based on their traditions, their ethnicity, their interests, to make them feel welcome, to really get, as we say, the welcome mat out from Michigan and from our industries that this is a welcoming community, a welcoming state, and we have the resources there. You just don't get into the state land and then how do you do it from here? So we've got some successful models that, again, as Brian said, this was an issue before COVID. And how do we help our folks that come in from other states and want to stay? and particularly in rural areas. So there are some models. We have a lot of work to do. Certainly the university presence on the west side of the state with Michigan State and others is helping escalate the educational attainment and the access to education at our community colleges and the folks where our rural people are. It isn't, in the rural areas specifically, particularly on the west side, it isn't as though they have close access to 4 or 5 universities to pick from. It's just not that way. So the universities coming to us is becoming a game changer. It is a game changer. And having the presence of the universities here, not just once in a while, but having a representative here, those are game changers for people, for their children, for keeping a labor force that will keep Michigan going on the pathway that we're looking toward. And then lastly, I would say all of the work that I do through the association, and I've done for many years through other projects related to healthier practice and more sustainable practices supported by infrastructure, education, logistics. To do that in a new way is the way the past panelist was talking about that. It can't be business as usual. However, how do we help someone new to the state, particularly if there's a language barrier, how do we help them do that in a more green way? And how do we help them move forward in practices that maybe would be more green than perhaps what they traditionally know? So those are the findings that we have had, and where we've really spent some time, we've been able to make some impact.
Well, it's great to hear all of that. And Marty, you started off talking about newcomers adapting to Michigan, but a lot of what you're describing is Michigan adapting itself and adapting its ecosystems to make sure that newcomers can be successful in Michigan. And I'll just add on that Michigan was really one of the early adopters, I would say, of building welcoming infrastructure, both at the local level and also at the state level. It's one of a handful of states that actually has somebody in a state Office of New Americans that's really attending to these kinds of issues. And we see that as a really vital part of the kind of infrastructure that is needed to be adaptive and needed to really pull at all these different threads that impact whether somebody is going to be successful as a newcomer in a community. And I know, Brian, you had started getting into some of those different threads that need to get pulled, that you're seeing childcare, other barriers. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what's needed to begin bringing that together in a more cohesive way?
Sure. So, so one thing we just had approved was the economic development strategy for Southeast Michigan, and from a lot of our research, what started to come out from the task force that we had assembled from it was that we developed some policy recommendations for trying to better connect people to jobs. And really one of those could be, for instance, encourage employers as well as the entire workforce development ecosystem to provide upskilling and retraining services to support career development. And another way of doing that is perhaps through creating career pathways, something called career pathways. So that would help workers and students get the education and training that are needed in advanced careers that may require similar skill sets. So maybe an example there would be, say, in hospitality, and you start off as, say, either a waitress or a cook. You could try to move up towards being a head cook, maybe go to culinary school, for instance, and that can advance your career to becoming a chef at a high-end restaurant. Or if you want to go to business school, you could learn to become a restaurant manager, for instance. So giving someone that guidance, if you will, for having more than just a job, but creating a career. And then the last thing was just also ensuring access to affordable broadband and devices for all. So having broadband provides, I think, like Marty was kind of getting to, it provides the opportunity for additional training in digital literacy. And then the last part, the childcare part of it, we really have we struggle to get people in a career for childcare. There's just not enough childcare to go around to get people into the workforce. So I think there needs to be career pathways created as well for childcare workers, and overall more support for the childcare industry to give workers the opportunity, to give parents really the opportunity to get into the workforce.
And thank you, Brian. And I'm seeing a couple of questions come in, and a few of them have to do with the role of government in supporting this work. And I wonder if you could just speak to that for a moment. And Marty would love your perspective on that too.
Sure. Yeah. So I can at least speak to SEMCOG's role. We work closely with local governments in Southeast Michigan to work on solutions for regional issues. And what we also do is we serve as a forum to enable local governments to collaborate with other stakeholders like the education community, business community, workforce development, organized labor. And maybe an example of that is this past summer, we held community conversations on the future of Southeast Michigan. And one of the conversations was on education and workforce. So participants talked about topics like career awareness and readiness, remote work. We provided data analysis on vulnerable workers and remote workers. And we summarized the conversation through a story map that's really accessible by anybody who wants it on our website, and included a resource library with links to our data analysis and forecast and mapping tools. So in essence, government, I think, can serve as a major support system to the education and the business community and workforce development too.
Thank you. How about for you, Marty?
Sure. What we have found is it gives the moms and the dads peace of mind to have the child care closest to where they are. The employers who have taken on this role have seen increase in productivity, not worried about staying an extra 15 minutes. When we were in the office, when we were all in the office, I assume at some point we'll be back in the office. Either way, to have that child care that is close to the person, we've seen an increase in productivity. So for the state and the feds to look at ways to support employers, to support their employees, which ultimately will support the future of our country, future of our state with the children, has been really important. And then for those private or even public daycares, there are models in other countries where childcare is just not the worry that it is in America. And the state and the federal government getting involved. And it really isn't just about the funding. It is about funding, but to help set up and support and regulate the child care centers. What the goal is really the best care for the child and to alleviate the worry from the parents. And there are models that show close proximity. There are models that show the ways that you set up a child care so that it really is flexible and adaptable to working parents. And those parents, women and men, who go into training, at least in the food industry, and I know in others, but one of the first questions they have to get into, to sit in training or sit at home and virtually in training, is what happens with the children. So some of the ISDs and high schools and community colleges have taken on a role to help with childcare so that the person can get trained, so that they can be hired, and so that we can start. So there's probably a simpler way, and maybe it is a cohesive approach. But I really think there's a huge role for the state of Michigan and for our federal government to take on a larger role around childcare. I think the East Coast looking at a 4-day work week. I only wish that would have happened a while ago. Now I'm helping our kids raise our grandkids, but I applaud that. I think they're going to see, they're already seeing in the studies they've done, more productivity from the employees, that much more time, that much more parent-child time with the kids. There are some innovative models, and I'm not saying our country hasn't tried them and isn't getting involved. I know my nephew's in Boston and they've got a really innovative childcare situation for them there. I'm not saying it's not happening. I'm saying we need to take a much bolder, stronger approach at childcare, because that always seems to be one of the common denominators around these discussions we have around labor.
Well, as a working parent of young children, I really appreciate this coming into the conversation. And then, stepping backward from that, I'll say, just in my own experience of communities going through demographic change, I know we're thinking ahead to the future, but really, this is a moment of shift that really asks of us to examine some of these underlying challenges, maybe in a new way with equity in mind. And I guess, maybe in the last few minutes that remain for us here, I would love just to hear a little bit about, from your perspective, what you would like to see look different 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and what values do you put at the center of that?
Well, for me, it's the person. If you take care of the person, the employee, and everything that surrounds him or her, you're going to get the productivity, the training, the resources that won't be such a struggle. So it's really focusing on the person, and it really, the stats that Brian and the work that they have done is awesome. That's terrific, and it really reinforces those models that we have just tried to test in a collaborative way. But if you take care of the collective person, and that talks to equity, talks to cultural infrastructure, talks to just common sense, you're going to have a more productive workforce, you're going to have a more engaged workforce, you're going to have a workforce. Why do we have labor shortages right now? We have disengaged citizens and folks who are here. Why are they disengaged? How do we make this, and again, there are models from all over the country. Seattle's doing some things that I think are very innovative. What works in Michigan and what really works best for our peninsula state that has 4 seasons and one of the seasons is really long. So what does that mean for supporting the entire person?
And I would say, for me, being a data person, I think it's important to keep looking at the metrics. So, a very simple question to look at is, has our labor force participation rate grown? And especially for working age, the prime working age population, ages 25 to 54. That's where it's really lowest. But also has it grown for, no matter what your education level is, no matter what what race you are, no matter if you have a disability or not. It needs to be a big lift to get everybody into the workforce, and I think there's going to be many avenues to go that direction. And the other thing too, so what we've also been doing too is developing dashboards to monitor the latest socioeconomic data for the region. So that way, we're hoping it will allow us to monitor how well our policies and actions in our economic development strategy are working. And if we need to change them, what needs to be done to change them.
And Brian, for you, is there a value or a North Star that you're holding in the work that you're doing around this?
I mean, for me, it's just simply knowing that we're going to continue collaboration, and I think knowing that we're going to we continually try to learn and improve our knowledge, knowing that our models can always improve, our data sources can always improve. So just continuing to educate ourselves and keep up with the issues so we can provide the best data possible for decision making.
Well, I think centering the person, centering collaboration feel like a high note to take us out on, and just want to thank you both so much for your time and the work that you're doing. I noticed in the chat there's and also in the questions, I think a real interest around a third pillar of this, which we haven't discussed in the equity conversation around, I would say, the organizing that's needed to make sure all of this work happens. And just want to share in the chat, Welcoming America as a resource. You have the resources for our speakers here as well. And if any of us, I'm sure I'm not going out on the limb in saying this, I'm sure if any of us can be a resource to you as you think about what's needed in your community, please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, maybe I'll turn things over now to Susan. Thank you both, Marty and Brian.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you, Brian and Maddie. This was an excellent session. We learned a lot from this session. So I'm thinking that we should maybe take a 1-minute bathroom break or grab a water break. And when we come back, we'll transition to just a small group activity. I will give a briefing on what the activity will look like in a minute. So if you need to just take a quick break, please do that. Okay, I think that we should transition to the next round. So right now we're going to be having breakout sessions. We had asked for the audience, you who is here, to indicate on your name the sessions that you'd be interested in, whether housing, infrastructure, or labor. And we'll try to assign you to those rooms. So basically what the session would be, it'll be a small group activity. We've had so many conversations across yesterday and today talking about housing issues, infrastructure, labor. And so this would be an opportunity to process what you've learned so far through a guided activity. There will be facilitators in each room that you'll be assigned to. And so they will give you more instructions about what that activity will look like. The session will be for 35 minutes. Also, a Jamboard will be used for the activity, and I will describe to you how to use Jamboard. So within Jamboard, a link will be posted in the chat below on how to access the Jamboard links. Actually, when you get into your rooms, the Jamboard links will be shared to you. But when you get there, click on the Jamboard link to open. It will show you a page, and you can scroll to the left to either choose a text box or you can use a sticky note. The instructions are on this slide that is being presented to you here. And while you're there, you can just enter in anything that you want to add to the board. If you're using a sticky note, you need to hit save, and you can always drag and position your notes within each of those 4 boxes in the matrix that will be described to you further. So right now, I'll turn it over to Brianna to assign you to the groups. And if you have any questions, please message Rachel Jacobson, or you can also send a message to Brianna. You can send an email to Brianna. And see you back here in 35 minutes. Okay, I hope you all had a great time doing the small group activity. Welcome back. So you had the opportunity to talk about challenges and opportunities based on the thematic area of interest that you indicated, and go through an activity where you identified or assigned these opportunities or challenges to simple, complicated, chaos, or complex categories on the grid. And so we'll invite our facilitators, assigned facilitators, to report out. First of all, I would like to invite Vidya, who would be providing a report out on a labor perspective. And after that, we'll go to Ashka. So Vidya, please share out.
Hey everyone, my name is Vidya Balasubramaniam. The labor group had a very productive discussion, I would say, about the labor workforce. We started off by acknowledging that labor, housing, infrastructure, and planning are all very closely connected. So we'd like to present our first challenge, which is climate gentrification. We talked about the challenges behind wealthy people moving, being the first wave of immigrants, and the associated issues with housing and land use development that might impact access to jobs amidst the existing low-income labor workforce. So that's a bit of a complicated challenge that we discussed, and we didn't really arrive at a solution, but wanted to present it as a need for which we need more pathways to understand and tackle this problem. And then an opportunity that we talked about is the fact that we can use all these new infrastructure and climate initiatives as a workforce development strategy. We thought that the Climate Corps is a good example. And then locally in Chicago, where I live, we found that the Chicago Conservation Corps is a great model for this. So those are our two key messages.
Thank you very much. Ashka?
Thanks, Susan. Let's see. We had a sort of wide-ranging ideas, less discussion around where they get placed in the matrix, but a couple of things that came up. I thought the big theme in our group was the idea of or the infrastructure related decision-making challenges in the sort of sending communities, or what could become sending communities, right? So the infrastructure challenges of today, where conversations may need to happen about out migration, but they are not. And then sort of the needs around even beginning to have those conversations, not just data and information, but before that, sort of the narrative and the storytelling. I think this does relate to how we sort of vision the receiving communities, or where communities may be able to move. So I think that was a sort of connected topic. Towards the end, we also sort of talked about how maybe potentially some of the sort of barriers related to even sort of managed slow or otherwise retreat relate to the sort of feeling of loss of social infrastructure that might come with moving. So those were a couple of things, but I think the team did a really good job of identifying a variety of ideas that you can access through our Jamboard. And then if any would like to take maybe a minute to chime in, I'd invite my group as well.
So I think we'll hold off on that. Let's give Devorah a chance to share perspectives on housing. And after that, we'll give it an open floor for anyone who has something really strong that you want to share to the group. So Devorah.
Can I, yes, thanks. I'm wondering if I could share my screen, if I could get hosting capacity to share my screen.
Brianna, are you able to?
I just made you a co-host, Devorah, so you should be able to screen share.
Perfect. Okay. So I just wanted to put this up while I talked, because there was a lot of really amazing ideas that were generated based on the conversation that we had. And we really didn't have enough time to get down to one or two, though one of the issues that did come up was, how could we extend this conversation to allow these breakout groups to have more time to actually talk through, even though we only had such a small group, there was so much information that was generated. The context that we gave this to think this through came from the conversations yesterday and today. So the actionable ideas, the challenges were within a frame of multi-sectoriality, a question of time scale, questions of risk, such as risk of failure or unintended consequences, equity, climate justice, and anti-racism, housing stock styles, aesthetics, which is something that I brought into the conversation, not that it had been discussed very much at all over the last day and a half, but the question of aesthetics and how important aesthetics is when we're talking about housing for migrants, place-based solutions, and the importance of networks in receiving communities. And up here, we see quite a few ideas in the simple matrix box, a 3 and 3 in the complex and complicated, and nothing in the chaotic. So I think that's my time, and I really loved the conversation, and I would love it if the group that I was facilitating had more time to actually talk through. There were a lot of cross pollination of ideas and some really, really interesting research and policy initiatives that are actionable and already about to be launched that I encourage you to take a look at. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now I want to welcome anyone who really has, something that they want to share with the group. Please do that now within the next 1 or 2 minutes. We'll just have comments from people who are interested in speaking.
If I could invite actually Amanda, there was a lot of interest in the reference that Amanda brought about the new funding, research funding opportunity. And I think this would be a great time for anybody left on the line to hear about it. So Amanda, could you do that in like a minute or two?
Yeah, sure, I could do that because I was just writing a dear colleague letter to announce this opportunity. And so this is through the Belmont Forum. We are a global consortium of funders from around the world. We anticipate this call to be able to support any researcher, stakeholder, sustainability practitioner, policy person across the world in this. So we have a lot of flexibility. And let's see, so it is focused on integrating migration, mobility, and global change, fields of thought, understanding, policy, all with a human-centric approach and what the Belmont Forum likes to call co-production, some people call engaged research, just working with the community and with stakeholders to solve problems. And so we are, the full call for proposals will open in April. But before that, before that, we are holding a whole series of networking activities and workshops to ensure that the community is adequately prepared to meet this call to action. And it's open to everyone, so we encourage you to join, and it's just going to be a really wonderful thing. So the link that I put in the chat, we call it CRA, that's Collaborative Research Action, because these are done in teams of individuals from around the world. And so, but we encourage local studies, regional studies, place-based solutions.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much. So please look for our website next week when we launch.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was great. Sarah has a comment. So please, Sarah, feel free to jump in.
This was just in the spirit of reading out from the groups, if you still want that. We were also speaking about the labor issues and opportunities and challenges in that context. And I think the most actionable ideas were, on the one hand, looking at in terms of the bigger and more complicated political challenges that relate to kind of potential competition between newcomers and people who are already in communities. Really that the investments that are being made in infrastructure now and receiving, welcoming, upskilling are all going to be good investments for the future of climate migration. So in a way, I think the observation was that oftentimes climate migration is being put into the chaotic bucket, that it's not clear what it means and how it's going to be tackled, and that what the process that we did today by breaking it down, what it means across different sectors, can already help a lot to bring it into the more actionable category where it's clearer in terms of what does this actually mean in terms of different interventions. The other, I think, was around just integration of climate forecasting, climate knowledge into existing economic and labor market forecasting, and better linking up the planning on the adaptation side and the labor market economic development side.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I agree with everyone that we don't have enough time to go through the excellent ideas that were presented in the various groups. But I just want to summarize by saying that there are some major themes that have come up from the current conversation now, and even from day one, which is really the role of partnerships and networks, thinking about partnerships across skills, across stakeholders, but also connecting sending communities with receiving communities. Also, we've talked about equity issues with access, access to housing, access to parks, access to labor opportunities for people who need to move. There's also the element of time scale, considering climate change and the time that will be required in planning. And also, finally, one other theme that has come up is the issue of data and how we need data to be able to make predictions, but also to plan appropriately for people who need to leave vulnerable areas. So thank you so much. And I'll give it up to Beth to continue and wrap up the session today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. And yeah, I feel like there's always a need for more time, for more conversation, for more opportunity to kind of thrash through these conversations. But we are reaching the end of our time together for this workshop. So I want to first put our thank yous front and center. Thank you to the presenters and the moderators today. Just a wonderful group of people. I thought that their remarks were incredibly inspiring and insightful, and I deeply appreciate the time and energy that you put into all of your work and your willingness to be here and share it with this community. Also, a thank you to our facilitators, this incredible list of people, of ASAP members who came together around this event to share their facilitation skills so that we're able to learn together, to be with one another, and not just to have a one-side conversation, but to really be able to take the power of the ASAP network and all of us who are in this adaptation community together and to collectively learn and share. So thank you to the facilitators who made this part of your work today. Oh, am I not sharing my screen? Sorry about that. And then, just briefly, before I transition us into our next steps, and great, thanks, Rachel. Oops. Sorry about that. Before I transition us into our next steps about what the future of this work can look like, I just want to take another moment to thank our project partners and contributors, many of whom we've heard from over the last 2 days. We began this work 18 months ago because we saw a gap in the growing work that researchers and practitioners were undertaking around migration. There were few people who were talking about in-migration and receiving communities, and we're so glad to have been able to play a role in really starting these conversations and bringing some of the energy and knowledge, expertise, and passion to the questions of who will migrate, where will those migrants go, and how will that migration affect people and livelihoods for both those in motion and people who are living in the places that we're looking toward as receiving communities. If you go to the next slide, I also want to make sure that we put just the finest point on the thanks that we want to show to Glisa and to NYSERDA for being early supporters and believers in this work, and also the expertise and the insights that were shared with us from Matt Hauer, Missy Staltz, Anna Morandi, Kelly Main, and Patrick Marchman, all of whom have helped us to explore these questions and have brought incredible expertise as we've added ASAP's unique approach to the climate adaptation challenges and opportunities. In our next slide. And this work wouldn't be possible without the facilitation, the direction, the support of the ASAP team. And so thank you so much to Susan and to Rachel for the work on this project over the last 18 months, and to the whole ASAP team who have come together to put together these sessions, these interactive conversations and collaborative spaces, because there is so much work that we have to do and so much work that we want to do together. It is always a team effort. And so as we kind of come towards the top of the hour, I want to remind us of some of the words which actually I'm bringing forward from our literature review, which really spoke about local institutions have both a heightened burden and an opportunity for climate migration. And we see partnerships with other cities, institutions, philanthropic, for-profit and nonprofit organizations as being key. For ASAP, as we think about continuing to advance our migration work, you can go on to the next slide. We're thinking about this work, seeking out partnerships and seeking out collaborators. I encourage those of you in the room who are working on your own migration projects to add those in the chat. I know we'll have already captured many of them. But over the next year, we're going to be looking to continue developing training and resources for practitioners across sectors, resources that will help them better frame climate migration as adaptation strategies as part of the holistic approach to building equitable and just communities, and thinking about how we connect both sending and receiving communities. We're also looking to continue convening and facilitating dialogue between researchers, practitioners, and with the expert guidance from affected individuals, ensuring that we're centering the lived experience of those who are part of the migration that climate change is forcing, not just in the Great Lakes region, but thinking about this as something that is happening throughout the North American context, where ASAP does all of its work and where our network comes from. We're looking forward to finding partners and also finding funders who want to support this work. So if this is aligned with work that you are engaging in or interested in engaging in, we encourage you to reach out. You can reach out to me, you can reach out to Rachel Jacobson or Susan Eco, and we'll warmly receive your messages and look for ways that we can continue to work together. If you want to go to the next slide, you can stay engaged in ASAP's work through our Climate Migration and Managed Retreat group. They meet the first Tuesday of every month from 3 to 4 p.m. And anybody who has been registered for this will be receiving an evaluation. Please complete it and send us your insights and feedback. And we'll also be sending recordings and resources from all of the work that we've done here together over the last 2 days. We always encourage you to dive more deeply into the ASAP network by joining us as a full member, as an individual, or as an organization. Our network is stronger with more diversity, more voices, more perspectives and wisdom, those that are both trained and those that have lived experience, and the combination of both. And so I encourage you to learn more about ASAP and reach out anytime. And my friends, I thank you for joining us for this conversation on climate migration, preparing receiving communities. Thank you again to Susan. Thank you again to Rachel. Thank you to all of our speakers, all of our moderators and our facilitators. I've really enjoyed our last couple of days together. I hope you have as well. And we look forward to seeing you at upcoming ASAP events. Thanks, everyone.